This is Module 5.1, which is an introduction to the school-to-prison pipeline. In this module, we will define the school-to-prison pipeline, discuss its historical development, identify contributing factors, address its impact on students of color, and this will set us up for the work that we will be poised to do in Module 5.2. This is a powerful quote from activist, scholar, and author Angela Davis that encapsulates what the school-to-prison pipeline is and how it impacts students' academic performance and school experiences. Sometimes a powerful quote is a great way to launch into a dialogue about a critical issue. Davis's words resonate because they help us understand the emotional and spiritual impact um, that the pipeline has on students. On this slide, we've included a really good solid definition of the school to prison pipeline. It gives us some historical background on the genesis and development of the school to prison pipeline and on some of the policies that have helped create this phenomenon. Zero tolerance policies, police presence in schools, law enforcement referral policies, and traditional teaching and classroom management practices are identified as some of those factors. On this slide, we take some time to examine how presidential criminal justice and educational policies have contributed to the school to prison pipeline. Historically, hysteria and fear over increases in crime, criminal justice practices that were not evidence-based, and the prison industrial complex, and also institutional racism have led to the creation of policies that were unnecessarily punitive and applied subjectively to students of color and other underserved groups. And these are factors that contribute significantly to this problem. From this list, you can see how each presidential administration has either contributed to the pipeline or attempted to address the problem. And it's interesting, if you look deeply, you'll see that there's about a 50-year span of time in which presidential administrations and national politics have contributed to the problem of the school to prison pipeline. Zero tolerance policies are one of the biggest drivers of the school to prison pipeline. Here we define zero tolerance policies, examine their characteristics, and identify how they may be problematic. The biggest issue and challenge is that they are subjective and applied based on the implicit biases of the educators who use them. This is why the pipeline targets students in certain groups, and we will identify and discuss some of those groups in subsequent slides. Something to remember about zero tolerance policies is that basically they're something that school officials are required to apply regarding certain punishments. So they really don't have wiggle room in terms of deciding, whether to apply them. Now, the wiggle room comes in terms of how they're actually applied, and we'll talk about that too as well. On this slide, we look at some examples of common offenses in which students are subjected to zero tolerance policies. They're very broad categories that are often applied, again, very subjectively, depending on who the educator is and on who the student is. Just from a historical perspective, the zero tolerance policies, the development of zero tolerance policies coincide with some of the presidential policies that we looked at a few slides back. Started to come into existence in the 1990s. Some of the common offenses that are guided by zero tolerance policies are included here as well. Here are some examples of how zero tolerance policies have been misapplied to students and have resulted in suspensions and in some cases expulsions from school. These are things that actually have happened. You can look at each situation and see just how ridiculous some of the circumstances and situations are. Kids miss class time for these reasons as a result of exclusionary discipline, and it has a negative impact on their school experiences. So we look at things like a ban on weapons, has been extrapolated to include things like butter knives and toy swords. Ban on drugs. Students have been disciplined for bringing things like aspirin and Midol to school. No fighting policies have led students who were involved in things just like pushing and shoving incidences and minor scuffles to be excluded from school. Insubordination, talking back to teachers. Disruption, cutting in the school line. So again, these are ways in which zero tolerance policies have been applied. We have discussed these issues in previous modules, but they have a direct connection to the school to prison pipeline. Again, the same groups of students are targeted and negatively impacted by policies and practices that lead them to perform less well in school. This is an example of why the achievement gap should be reframed as an opportunity gap. And again, in some of our uh, previous modules, we've talked about the demographic groups that are affected um, by these discriminatory policies. African American students, of course, black boys and black girls, other students of color, Latino students, Native American students, and also students with disabilities. So we've touched on this before, but we need to take a deeper look at how such policies affect students in these groups. Exclusionary discipline refers to situations in which students are excluded from class due to suspension or expulsion. Zero tolerance policies are often the reason why students are suspended or expelled from school. In keeping with the last slide here, we look at disparities in the application of exclusionary discipline by race in U.S. schools and in some specific states. One of the most striking things to think about is that this is a problem that begins in preschool. Black preschoolers are 3.6 times more likely to receive at least one out of school suspension than their white peers. So it's not just a K through 12 problem. This starts as soon as kids start attending school. We've talked a lot about African American students, and there are some important statistics there in reference to that. But we also have to look at Latino students. They're often we don't look closely enough at them in the school to prison pipeline. They're 1.3 times more likely to be suspended from school than their white counterparts. We also have to look at that last bullet. Native American students are suspended from school at 2.54 times the rate of their white counterparts in the state of California. So again, these are significant issues that absolutely have to be examined. In this slide, we examine the history of school policing and examine the role they are supposed to play in making schools safer places for students to learn in. We also see how resources have been increasingly allocated over time to lead to a seemingly ever-expanding police presence in U.S. schools. Over time, you can see how more resources have been applied to in-school policing. And if we look at school policing, talk about school police officers, they're generally referred to as SROs or school resource officers. They're generally career law enforcement officers who are assigned to work in one or more schools, and their goal is to um, prevent crime, stem violence, and also stop school shootings, which has become an increasing problem in American schools. We see the origins of school policing beginning in the 1950s, uh, but the presence of cops in schools began to explode in the 1990s in keeping with some of those national policies that we discussed earlier. And you can see from the bullet points how the amount of money that's put into school policing has expanded, and also how the number of police officers in schools have expanded as well. Okay. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what is the true impact of establishing and maintaining a police presence in schools? They're supposed to make schools safer, but that's not necessarily the case. In some instances, a police presence in schools correlates with negative student outcomes. Traditional wisdom suggests that school SROs contribute to a safe, orderly, and equitable environment, but the research suggests otherwise. SROs don't necessarily make schools safer. In 2018, almost in about 200 gun violence incidents. SROs only intervened successfully twice, and also there are negative correlations with the presence of school police officers as well. In schools that have SROs, um, kids are more likely to be referred to the criminal justice system, or suspensions and arrests are higher, and they're also more likely to be arrested for disorderly conduct. Okay, there's also racial gaps that need to be examined. There's significant differences in how students perceive the presence of SROs based on race and socioeconomic status. These perceptions are borne out by the data. A quick note about this picture. Back in 2015, an SRO at a high school in South Carolina flipped a girl out of her seat and arrested her because she would not put her cell phone away when he asked her to do it. Or when the teacher asked her to do it, actually. It created a national stir. The SRO was fired, but was not disciplined. Another student caught the incident on video and posted it on Snapchat. The video went viral. And if you've ever seen the incident, it is particularly striking and violent, and it led to a nationwide stir. Um, Racial gaps in the way SROs are perceived. You see differences between how they're, I'm sorry, racial gaps in the differences between how SROs perceive threats. In more upscale suburban communities, they're more worried about outside intruders, but in urban schools and schools with lots of students of color, they criminalize students and they perceive students as the actual threat. That following statistic is striking. In 43 states and in Washington, D.C., black students are more likely to be arrested than other students. Um, Here's more data involving experiences of black and Latino students uh, in specific locales and nationally. The last point is very important. Oftentimes, students of color attend schools that have SROs but don't have counselors, nurses, and other important resources. And again, for the statistics here in Connecticut and in New York, we're seeing how Latino and Black students are treated differently in schools that have SROs. Two concepts need to be addressed when analyzing the school to prison pipeline: criminalization and adultification. Both are defined here. A brief examination of how each of these factors contribute to the school to prison pipeline are included here as well. The subjectivity of criminalization and the impact of adultification are considered as well. Okay, so criminalization, that's when school-based student misbehaviors are essentially criminalized by schools and local judicial officials. Adultification, that's a form of bias in which students of color are treated as being more mature than they actually are uh, by reasonable developmental standards. If we look back at criminalization, it's very interesting to look at this whole idea of disturbing school. This is considered a criminal act in 22 states, but it's completely subjective. And as you can see from the states that are listed here, it's seen very differently depending upon the state. It's also seen differently in terms of, again, who the educator is and who the student is. And bias, implicit bias, seeps into how disturbing school is regarded. In terms of adultification, it contributes to serious race and gender-based disparities in likelihood of being suspended, severity of punishment, access to resources, and other factors as well. Here are two powerful quotes from Monique Morris that I've included on this slide. She's the author of Push Out, a book that closely analyzes the criminalization and adultification of Black girls in schools. In her quote, she addresses the dehumanization of Black children and other children of color that is at the root of criminalization and adultification, and how both feed into the school to prison pipeline. Monique Morris is a very important resource if you want to explore this issue further. The adultification of Black girls is a critical issue that needs to be closely examined. On the left, you see how the adultification affects educators' perceptions of Black girls, and on the right, you can clearly see the educational impact these perceptions have on their school experiences as well. And as we know, perception oftentimes influences reality. So those perceptions are very striking. Perceptions are that black girls need less nurturing, need less protection, need to be supported less, need to be comforted less, are more independent, know more about adult topics. And in terms of their educational impact, these perceptions often bleed into harsher punishments, fewer opportunities for leadership and mentorship in schools. Um, Educators often use more punitive methods with black girls who commit infractions. Black girls experience greater use of force, as we saw from the picture of the young lady getting flipped out of the chair, and generally just face harsher penalties. Adultification affects how black children are disciplined in comparison to their white peers. In this slide on the left, you see the comparison between black girls and white girls. On the right, you'll find the comparisons between black boys and their white counterparts. There are disparities on both sides, but as you can see, the disparities are greater for black girls than they are for black boys. Adultification takes an even greater toll on black girls. And again, the statistics are striking. If we look in the middle, black girls are 3 times more likely to be disciplined for disruptive behavior than their white counterparts, while black boys are 1.5 more likely to be disciplined for that same behavior. Black girls are 3 times more likely to be disciplined for fighting than their white counterparts. Black boys 1.6 times um, more likely for fighting. And you see the pattern, um, but it's very, very important. And it's just really interesting to see that when you break it down by gender, um, black girls are seen more as a threat as compared to their white counterparts than black boys are seen to their white counterparts. But again, it's a problem for both gender groups. Um, this adultification in black girls is seen also in the juvenile justice system. Black girls are more likely to be referred to the juvenile justice system and to experience exclusionary discipline more than their white counterparts. In this slide, we see the statistics. The picture is inspired by an actual incident at an Orlando charter school about a year and a half ago. A 6-year-old black girl supposedly had a tantrum and was handcuffed and arrested by the SRO. Again, the incident was captured on video and caused a nationwide outcry about the criminalization of black girls. And again, some of the stats here are striking. Black girls are 20 times more likely to be formally petitioned than their white counterparts, and 2.7 times more likely to be referred to juvenile justice than their white counterparts. Now, why does this all matter? Okay. We've examined the phenomenon of the school to prison pipeline and looked at the statistics. The key points are that the school to prison pipeline reinforces educational inequity by leading children of color to have significantly worse school experiences and to perform more poorly than their white counterparts. The information on this slide demonstrates this. Inequities in disciplinary practices deny opportunities to learn for students from underserved backgrounds. It is not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap, and we need to be very clear about that. Okay, so again, the dehumanization of children of color is a huge problem. Students affected have negative school experiences, and this affects these disciplinary disparities affect their school experiences and outcomes. Poor African academic performance, lower levels of engagement, greater risk of leaving school early, less likely to engage in and complete post-secondary educational opportunities, more likely to become involved in the criminal justice system. The pattern continues to repeat itself. And on this side, we see a few more examples of how the school to prison pipeline affects students and why it matters. So again, this introduction to the school to prison pipeline is designed to um, just give us a broad understanding of the issue. In our next module, we will identify and apply practices educators can engage in to mitigate the effects of the school to prison pipeline.